On the RDA Tiger. Oh, I was just about to do that. So I'll start again. Thanks for whoever hit record there. So welcome everybody to this cross-fertilization webinar of the RDA Tiger project. My name is Ryan O'Connor. I am the senior facilitator on the project. So this webinar is on the topic of mappings and making mappings fair. So yeah, as you know, the session is being recorded. So we do have a pretty full agenda. So what I'll do now, I'll just maybe introduce who's going to be speaking and what we're going to be talking about, and maybe just take a minute or two, maybe 3 minutes to introduce the Tiger project and maybe put this cross-fertilization webinar series in context, and then I'll hand over to our first presenters. So yeah, we'll have three main presentations here from three RDA working groups. So the first is the harmonized terminologies and schemas for fair data in material sciences and related domains working group. So the presentations there will be from Gerhard Goldbeck and his fellow co-chair Marek Chauer from that group. Then I'll hand over to Sveinung Gundersen, who's one of the co-chairs of the Verification of Genomic Annotations working group. And then finally, Jonas Kastaniemi, who is the one of the co-chairs of the FAIR mappings working group. So each of those presentations will be about maybe 10 to 12 minutes. We'll try and keep roughly to that time. And then we'll hopefully have space at the end for discussions. So yeah, as I said, we'll have the Q&A at the end, but if you do have questions in the meantime, please feel free to share them in the chat. Presenters and other people who are involved with these working groups and others in general, I encourage you to respond via the chat as well, if that makes it easier. But yeah, we'll circle back to any of those questions towards the end as well. Cool. So just a quick minute or two, just to give a bit of a background on the RDA Tiger project. So for those of you who aren't aware of what we've been doing, so the project has been running since the start of 2023. It's funded by the European Commission, so it's run by ourselves, RDA Europe, along with our colleagues CoData in France, DANCE in the Netherlands, and the Netherlands eScience Centre. So we're actually really in the last stretch of the project. We've rounded the last bend and all that. So this project will be wrapping up in December 2025. So about a month from now. So essentially what we've been doing for the last 4 or 3 years even is putting in place various different types of support for RDA working groups. So we have a kind of just an overview of the types of support we've been providing here on the right. So there has been in-kind support. So these different services, facilitation, communications, output, and landscape and engagement services to support groups through their life cycle. And we've also been providing financial support in the form of these engagement of external expert grants and larger cascade grants, and also travel grants as well, which we've provided to previous RDA plenaries. And then we've also developed this RDA knowledge base, which I have a link to this in a few slides' time. But this essentially is a kind of suite of tools that allow for the annotation and graphing of various outputs to do and documents to do with RDA. The project really, we've been doing a lot of reporting in the last couple of weeks as the end comes into sight. The project has been, I think, I can say this without being too sort of boastful, has been very successful. We've supported a lot of different groups through a lot of to get started and through their sort of developing their recommendations and outputs. With some of the figures here on screen, just to give you an idea of what types of support and the amount of things we provided the community with. So this webinar series then, so this is the second of the 2 webinar series we've held. So essentially what we're trying to do with these webinar series is so I've explained how the Tiger project was aiming to support groups kind of from an operational perspective and to make their lives easier essentially and make their work more impactful. But on the other side of that as well, we're trying to make the connection between these groups we're supporting, their outputs, and the wider sort of European community. Obviously, we're funded by the European Commission, so that is one of our priorities. So as I said, as we have here, and one of the missions of one of the many missions of the Tiger project was to develop these working groups links with European and global initiatives, and to support the kind of international engagement and alignments of various different outputs that groups produce according to these things that are of concern for the EOSC development and for the European open research and open science community in general. One of the ways we've been doing that recently is we've put together this large-scale landscape analysis of the value of RDA outputs to EOSC. So essentially, we've looked at a couple of different features of the European landscape and mapped on to these the outputs and activities of RDA working groups, and we've kind of identified where the work of RDA and where the continued work of RDA and future work of RDA can be impactful in these contexts. So this report, as I said, now we're working on this at the moment. We will have this published before the end of the year, and we'll be doing a lot of promotion on this further later this year and into next year as well. It's quite a large-scale document, but so we'll hopefully be doing a little bit of more segmenting and promotion of this over the next couple of weeks and months. So please keep an eye out for that. So this really is kind of putting into context why we're running this series. Let's check the time. We want to kind of make the connections between these topics that are of concern to the European community and also of concern to multiple different RDA groups. So we're trying to bring people together from within the community. As I said, now this is the second of the series we've held. We held 3 around this time last year on the topics of semantic interoperability, on data and metadata standards, and the adoption of the fair care and trust principles. All these, the recordings of all these are available on the RDA Association YouTube channel, and there's a QR code there on the right. I'll just note that that isn't a typo. We didn't forget the N there. We just didn't put it in. I think there's a word or a letter limit when we're creating a YouTube channel, but that's the one. So you'll find the cross-fertilization webinars from last year available there. We also have a couple of upcoming events. I'm going to skip past these quickly because they're on the slide later on as well. But if you have your phone to hand and you want to scan, we have another installment of this cross-fertilization webinar series around this time next week on the topic of repositories and trustworthiness and certification. And we also have a few hands-on sessions of the knowledge base, which I've mentioned. We have a few of those coming up in the next 2 weeks, morning and evening sessions, just to kind of give people a better feel of what the knowledge base can do for you, essentially. So with that, I will hand over to Gerhard, who is presenting on behalf of the Harmonized Terminologies and Schemas for Fair Data in Material Science and Related Domains Working Group. Gerhard, please, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Ryan. And yeah, just to say, Marek Czewiczał is also here. So Marek, I'll present, but you chime in. We are, as you can see here, co-chairs of this working group. I'm not going to read our long title again. Together with a number of other people from the US, from Japan, also from the UK, from Korea. We've really been benefiting from the support from the RDA Tiger team. Originally, first of all, it was Ryan O'Connor, which I should mention here as well. In fact, but then for some time now, Athena Papadopoulou has been supporting us, and also we've benefited from one of the expert grants with Hotel Orosioni supporting us as well. So if we go then to the next slide, then we'll get into what we've done. But basically, we're coming or reached the end of the working group time. So we're about to report on and finalize the report and publish them on the final recommendations. Basically, I'll mention them in a minute, but they point to 2 field guides. One is concerned about the fair maturity of the semantic artifacts in the community, and the other is for looking at the fair maturity of data. And so they make recommendations about them. You can access all via the final report link here already. In the next slide, then you see the kind of high-level recommendations to embrace fair data principles throughout the life cycle, fair data maturity, and so on. So quite well known, but they then point to the details which are in these field guides. Today, because of the interactions here and the cross-fertilizations, I'm going to concentrate a bit on the point about adopting the general purpose semantic artifacts for materials and chemistry domains, in particular to utilize the DCAT standard and DCAT applications profiles for the materials domain, and also use schema.org as part of that, which requires further work, really, that we think we should have a further session, not at the next plenary, but probably the one after that. That's what we're aiming for. And then, to create mappings of the semantic artifacts to these general purpose and domain-specific vocabularies and ontologies, which is, of course, what we're discussing here. In the next slide, then we will see some of the issues that have been highlighted, that there is a lack of currently a long-term sustainable repository for MatChem semantic artifacts, that there is a need for controlled vocabularies, including their governance, and the need for what I already mentioned, an agreed application profile for our field, which is kind of similar to what in the cross-domain interoperability framework is referred to as a content model. And so this lack of a reference for the high-level metadata for the materials domain. And I'll come to illustrate that in the next slides if you go on. Then if we look at the current situation, so I'm going to go now into a little bit more of the results that were much more detailed in this expert report that looked at the current situation and recommendations for these metadata in the field, and for basically data cataloging as an example, so DCAT related. And then that reviewed the current situation and the implementations from various initiatives in Europe, the US, Korea, and Japan. Not surprisingly, there is an agreement that there should be some sort of hierarchy. So first of all, general cross-domain metadata, then some high-level material science metadata, and then more detailed and domain-specific materials metadata, which are, of course, then left to the domains to define. But, there are different ways of doing this, different implementations, different sets of metadata, and there is no material science controlled vocabulary, which is already important even at the very highest level. So, for example, if you submit anything into Zenodo, for example, today, then it will say the subject field of study, and then it uses EuroCyBOC for that, which has some good terms. But if you go into a little bit more detailed fields, there's nothing that comes from our field that is really defined from our field that gives the subjects and fields of study that are really relevant here. That was also already found in a recent survey by, for example, the UK Physical Science Data Infrastructure initiative that surveyed controlled vocabularies and found, well, the only usable one is really EuroCyBOC, although it's also not ideal. So that's like one specific example. On the next slide, then, I just picked, for this short talk, the examples from Japan and Korea. So they are already, reasonably well established, or being more introduced via national services. So on the left-hand side in Japan, from the MDR, the materials data repository, you have the generic ones are organization, URL, title, resource, and so on. So then you have generic material science ones, then you have method-related, instrument-related, specimen-related ones. Whereas Korea does something a bit similar, but then you have already a view or perspective on materials studied as being made out of a system of materials. And within that system, you then have different specific materials metadata. So you can sort of see some hierarchy, but also see very clearly that they are really not totally compatible, and not easily compatible views. So this is where we are. That's what the situation is. So we need to obviously then find good mapping solutions, because I don't think we'll come up with, okay, this is the hierarchy and the metadata we define. We need to clearly define common things like I've addressed in colors here, material name appears, chemical information or composition appears, property appears, structure appears. So they need to be commonly defined, but also then mappings introduced between implementations of these that are done in different countries, different regions, and by different communities within our field, so that we can actually achieve interoperability between resources that are actually deposited in these different initiatives. So on the next one, I think that's probably it. Yeah, I mean, recommendations, of course, the first level of generic metadata following CD recommendations, second level of physical science, material science metadata, where, yeah, the ones basically are highlighted previously in the colors come up. We need better definitions or elucidations and so on, what they stand for. And then the third is the responsibility of the domains. Control vocabularies are required. And in the final slide, I think basically the next one is, yeah, the mapping is required. So mappings crosswalks need to be developed, and that's where we are. And I'm very much looking forward to the next talk, which I think is from a field that has taken this situation and gone quite a lot further on actually introducing mappings.
Great. Thank you, Gerhard. Thank you first for this really good overview of the of what this group is doing, what the Harmonized Terminologies group is doing. And thanks also for keeping the below time, which is great. I just had a quick look at the chat. I couldn't see any questions, but seeing as we went quite, Gerhard went quite promptly through that presentation, does anyone have any questions at this stage, or do we want to maybe save them up, maybe stew on the presentation for a few minutes and save them up towards the end? Would anyone feel free to open their microphone? Okay. I have a few maybe questions, but I think in the interest of time, we can maybe circle back to them a bit later. I will hand over next to Sveinung. So Gerhard, thank you you made a useful link to the next presentation. So this is from Sveinung Gundersen, who is one of the co-chairs of the Verification of Genomic Annotations Working Group, along with Adam, Anna, and Nathan, who are also co-chairs. Sveinung, I will hand over to you. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Yeah, so I will not repeat. If you go up, I'll say just a few words. First of all, thank you to Ryan, who's been the facilitator for the whole period, and I think we will very much miss him next year, and when we see how much he has been helping us with. So thanks a lot. And also mentioning that we also got expert support from the RDA Tiger for Gavin Chait. That was for a biohackathon project on biodiversity. So last year, so that was very useful. Okay, so we can move on to the next slide. Okay, so this is just sort of briefly what this is about, because I assume most people here are not from the life sciences. This is, so genomic annotations is a specific type of data. It's a subtype of data, which is, I guess you can call it secondary. And basically, I mean, you're just going to very briefly explain this. So, as you probably know, genome is the totality of DNA in an individual, and you can sort of, from the computer point of view or informational point of view, you can express it as a sequence of letters, one for each of these 4 nucleotides, and then you have like a very, very long sequence like this. So actually one per chromosome anyway. The problem, of course, is that you need to understand what this actually means, and that's where the annotations come in. So basically you take different regions of this, or different ways of selecting parts of the sequence, and then annotate it with some more information explaining what this is. Or it could also be outputs from experiments that's been done, or things like well, also manual annotation of this. And one example of that is, and I guess the most fundamental example is the genes themselves. So parts of this sequence have been found to be genes, and that's a very fundamental annotation. So basically, at least in the basic sense, you have a series of these data elements across a one-dimensional line, and that's what you call a genomic annotation, or also track is used in terms of, or in the context of visualizing. So you can see here on the right hand side, it's a bit of a fun image here, but these genome browsers, that's a way to visualize these different annotations, and you can sort of browse through the whole genome in this way. So what is lacking here for a number of years is metadata for this. And since this is sort of after a series of processing steps, you end up with this type of data. Typically, the metadata that exists is more on the formal level, on the basic like experiments and stuff. Okay, so we move to the next slide. So just a brief overview of what we have been doing and still planning to finalize in some way or form. So basically, we want to see if we can create a basic community-driven infrastructure for metadata for these genomic annotations. And I should have had a slide for that, but also importantly is that we're trying to do this across both biomedical and biodiversity fields. And as far as I know, this is the first attempt of doing that. So basically, there is existing metadata in various forms according to different schemas and different repositories available. And we want to take all of these, or make it possible to take these sources and transform it into a common metadata model. And then one thing that we need to think about, and we're starting to think about now, is how to do this in a scalable and maintainable way. And that's also very much our interest in the FAIR mappings, because that is definitely sort of slightly overlapping the scope of the FAIR mappings working group. And then into this schema, and also including some thinking about identifiers. I will not go more into that here. And then we want to also provide some recommendations for how to take this harmonized metadata and make this publicly available and searchable. Next slide, please. Yeah, so I'll not go in so much in detail here, but basically at the end of this, we are envisioning that different services can extract this metadata, provide search functionalities or other things. We're also looking into having like a uniform search API, so that if different services are doing this, then they can do it in a similar way. Okay, next slide, please. So in this context, I'll be focusing mostly on the different some mappings that we have provided. First of all, this is an overview of the data model that we finalized in more or less the first version before summer, and doing some sort of refining of that now. And this is an overview of the different entities, and there's a number of fields that's not listed here now. One of these is the experiment, and that's I've highlighted that because that will be for the first mapping example that I'm going to show in the next slide. So please. Okay, so we tried to not reinvent the wheel, and I'm sure we've done that lots already. But one of the things that we actually managed to not reinvent the wheel was how to describe an experiment. So experiment is there. A sequencing experiment in the lab. So there is a standard that was just released some weeks ago from the Global Alliance for Genomics and Health, or GA4GH, which is called Experiments Metadata Checklist, XPMEDA. And we've been following that development of that, and we found, okay, this is perfectly matching our needs for describing experiments. So we are taking that, but as you can see here, it's not just a perfect mapping. We have taken some fields from different parts of that checklist, reorganized a bit, renamed it a bit, and we're also changing things like whether things are required or optional, and the data types. So this is taking existing schema and transforming it slightly to our use case, not selecting all fields and so on, and then mixing that with a couple other fields that we found lacking. So this is a type of mapping that I'm a bit unsure that have been discussed in the fair mapping working group. So I'll we'll come back to that later. Yeah, and then the next slide. Or actually, if there's any questions, because perhaps you can take questions for each mapping before we move to the next one. Perhaps that might be better, though. Just to make sure that you understand what this is about.
Would anyone like to pose a question to Sveinung, or feel free to use the chat again? I'll just have it open here.
Okay.
I have a more general question, perhaps. I don't know if I should ask this now or at the very end.
Perhaps, I mean, you could ask it now. I was more thinking to focus on the mappings now, but please take it now.
No, I was just wondering, because you mentioned the biomed things and genomic annotation. So how do you handle, and I apologize if this is off topic, but how do you handle rare diseases where it will be very easy to identify where the information, from which person this information comes from, once you have the genomic information?
Yeah, so it's good questions. We haven't really focused on that. I mean, mostly we are focusing on public data. That's where we're starting on, and not sort of person identifiable, or if it is, then it's everybody knows who it is. In any case, but of course that is an extension that we would could expand with, and there's other projects going very much in detail on how to do this. So hopefully we'll try to adapt their solutions in terms of accessibility and I mean securing this information, privacy. But that's, we haven't really focused on that.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
Okay, so this second mapping example. So this is when we created the data model, we wanted to have an example, for each of these fields, and we decided to have like a full example, so that all the examples for each field, they refer to the same thing. So you can sort of take this whole column in the spreadsheet, and this will be a data set. And in this case, we actually then found some data from two different sources. So this is first something called IHEC, which is International Human Epigenomic Consortium, which is collecting already metadata from various sources. But then the metadata they provided was not enough, so we also need to go back to the original source. And in this case, actually, we couldn't find an identifier, so we had used the MD5 sum to perfectly identify a file here, and then mapping from these two sources into the schema. So I think that is also one thing that you might have not thought about. Next example. Yeah, so this is from a biohackathon. So there's the Elixir has a biohackathon that just happened now in Berlin a couple of weeks ago, where we collected different projects working on biodiversity. And what we ended up here was defining what we call the convenience schema, because this whole metadata model is very complex for lab scientists to handle. So basically we created a short schema from which we would be able to extract all the other things. But in order to actually extract that, we are assuming that a lot of this information is already deposited in the databases. So for biosamples, for instance, is one of these databases that's very much used. So basically, the idea is to take this input, look up in the database, and extract and also enhance with ontology terms, and then fill out the the entire model based on that. So that is, I think, a third type of mapping that we have been looking into. Next slide. I think the last slide. So this is just information about the group. This is the co-chairs, Anna Bernasconi, myself, Nathan Sheffield, and Adam Wright. And some links here.
Great. Thank you, Sveinung. Yeah, so again, thank you for the really interesting, good overview of what the group is doing. I know you mentioned I have been involved with this group from the start. It's been really interesting. I'm not from a biosciences or medical background, so I'm still trying to get my head around what all this means. But no, I think that was really, really useful. Does anyone have any clarification questions on what Sveinung has presented in the last 10 minutes or so before we move on to our final presentation and then move on to the open Q&A?
I just have one quick question. Just a clarification between the difference between annotations and metadata in the project. Is the metadata kind of what you're annotating for in the genomic sequence?
Yeah, so there's a sort of confusion that's been happening. So annotation, I mean, that is the best name we have for this, but this is a data set. So this is the actual data. So these are files that contain this annotation, and the metadata is sort of meta on that again. So we have, I mean, these the annotations describe the genome, and the metadata we are adding is describing the annotation file or the process of annotating, who has done that, and where is it located, in which context, and sort of these kind of things.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
Gerhard, please.
Yeah, just thank you. Yeah, I was just looking at this slide, which is the slide 18 in the whole deck. Where you have, let's say you have data already in public repositories that are already in the repositories. So they've used whatever metadata existed at the time, and then now you're coming with this minimum metadata set, so that I guess when I then search through different repositories, right, that an API can sort of map them, or can you work with the assumption that they will be the same, or you have some sort of mapping functions or between, I mean, like I showed in our field, like they're kind of nearly the same but not quite the same, and so on. So how do you deal with that, or intend to deal with that situation?
Yeah, so man, that needs to be defined for each case, typically, because they're all slightly different. I think the entities typically are quite similar, because there are some old models that we based this on, so that but also there's typically lacking information, or they're not using ontologies typically, and so on. So there's all of these issues that we will have to tackle that we haven't really started with yet. Yeah,
but I guess the strategy is that again, trying to learn and see what you do and what we do is what you're defining a reference, right? And everything will be then, in the end, the idea is that everything will be mapped through that reference. So you don't have like many to many sort of mappings, but it will be that the reference is the one that's used at the API level, and then you kind of map to legacy metadata and so on, obviously on a case-by-case basis. Yeah, so that's what the aim is, right?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Okay.
And also, I mean, we will also not contain everything, so we'll refer back to the original metadata if it's more detailed. So this is sort of a selection of the most useful fields for discovery. Yeah.
Yep. Okay.
Thank you, Gerhard. I see there are a couple more hands raised in the chat from Marek and from Lauren. Apologies both, but it would be okay if we could maybe come back to your questions, or maybe if you want to put them into the chat, if they're for Sveinung, maybe Sveinung can pick them up in the chat. Just in terms of timing, let's move on to our final presentation, and we'll have time at the end then to loop back to these. Apologies both. And thanks again, Sveinung, and thanks again everybody for your questions so far. Jonas, I guess you are next up. I'll hand over to you.
Yes, thank you, Ryan. So I'm Joonas Kesäniemi and one of the co-chairs of the FAIR Mappings Working Group, and here's a small info box of our group. So we have two other co-chairs, and we have really, really enjoyed the Tiger support. I mean, and it's been essential. And I should also have added Ryan there, so because he was essential to the setting up the group in the beginning. But Lisa has been our Tiger support in the past months, and then we have been lucky enough to also get expert support from Nico related to the liaison with the existing groups and communities, and also setting up the technical infrastructure for running our daily work. Next slide, please. So one of the main deliverables that we're aiming to produce is make it easier to communicate about mappings. And towards that end, we have been creating this terminology and conceptual model about mappings. Because, and for example, in this picture here or figure here, you can't, there's not just a mapping anywhere. That mapping is always somehow qualified, because that was one of the main reasons for confusion, because people use the word mapping in very different ways. And for example, here we make distinction between executing a mapping or some other mapping activity, could be the creating of a mapping, and then the mapping specification, which is the artifact that does the actual mapping. So that would be, for example, some sort of file resource that is the mapping specification. And the mapping specification can have mapping relationship, different kinds of mapping relationships. So those are what were often called as just individual mappings, but now we have been calling them mapping relationship. And here you can see that those can be further divided into correspondences, which are basically any kind of relationship between two things, and then mapping relationship expressions, which is a more formal kind of mapping relationship, and because it can be even either a function-based expression or a predicate-based expression. And when it comes to mapping specifications, we have identified two major categories. So schema mappings and mapping sets. And the mapping set here comes from the SESOM world. And so we wanted to align the concepts to the work that has been already done with SESOM. But we're thinking about this third type of mapping specification, which is instance level mapping, and I will show an example soon. And here are a couple of examples of the instantiation, or kind of a concrete mapping specification. So there's a LinkML, XSLT, code-based mappings, and the SESOM document. And what does these then actually mean when you go to the real world and you have mapping? So next slide, please. I'm trying something new here. So this example has been taken from the previous plenary presentation. So it's about existing mapping between DataSite and the site DCAT AP. And it's available, and it's a really nice document. It has different aspects. There's a document for humans, and there are some XSLTs linked and all that. But if you look at it from a schema mapping perspective, this is what the mapping basically describes. You have a source model, and in this case, it's the XSD, the XML schema of the DataSite. You create a mapping. You create a mapping specification. In this case, there are three different mapping specifications in XSLT, in LinkML map, and in Python. They work with the same conceptual model, but the technical data model that they produce as a target model are different. So the XSLT produces site DCAT AP shackle, and actually that's the same as the Python, and these are just an examples. It could be anything else. And the LinkML map produces actually a LinkML file. So from this thing, you can see when you have a specific mapping specification at your disposal, you usually it has some source model and some target model when it comes to schema mapping. Next slide, please. And in an instance mapping, this is maybe the data side XML is a bad example of an instance mapping. You could think of it as you could think like an API, for example, as the source instance. So an API providing some kind of data. And again, when you create a mapping, you can have the same mapping specifications there. But you might not have the models, but you just map to another data set or another target data. So in this case, it's the RDF XML for the XSLT, because that's the actual concrete artifact that the XSLT actually creates. Similarly, the linkML map implementation of the mapping specification creates a YAML file. And again, the Python, in this case, it's a non-existent Python code that would create the same graph as the XSLT, but in turtle format. So the target instance format is different, but they all are about the same conceptual model. Next slide, please. And then when it comes to the mapping sets, what can be considered as a correspondence is that if you don't have formal model of the source and target, but you have some idea of the conceptual model, it can be a Word document that describes the conceptual model, and you create. I would put all the mapping tables, the custom spreadsheets that describes mappings or mapping relationships into this bin. So the mapping table, mapping specification, and I would call them correspondences in this case. So all of those relationships, as opposed to more formal representation of a mapping specification. If you go to the next slide, please, which is a predicate-based mapping set where you have formal source model and formal target model. In this case, non-existence, or there's an assumption that there's a data side ontology, and there is a site DCAT AP ontology that you can actually use. And then when you express the mapping specification through SESOM, that creates a predicate-based mapping set that can be, for example, processed automatically and or used in automated workflows. Next slide, please. And then when you have created the mapping, what you then can do, especially when it comes to schema mapping, you can execute it. And then you basically are dealing with these kind of resources. So you have the source instances that confirm to some models. You execute the mapping specification that has an input and output, and the output again conforms to the models so this is kind of like the full picture. This is the ideal thing, that if you have all of these, you can do validation. You know what you get from when you have a mapping. You know what the source looks like, what it should look like, and what the target should look like. Next slide, please. And in order to capture this information, we have created the first version of the fair mappings metadata, the logical model, basically. It's implemented in linkML. There's a picture that you can't probably see, but that's by design. It's a first initial draft and the cardinalities and the names and the enumerations that I will come back to soon are still in flux. And for example, from the Sveinung's presentation, where you had the two sources for the mapping specification, that's, for example, not supported at the moment. There's only one source and one target. So that's something that maybe the cardinalities should be tweaked a little bit. This is not SESOM model, but this is aligned with SESOM. So basically, we have tried to make sure that there is a mapping specification can be created between the SESOM mapping set metadata and the fair mapping specification metadata, and the other way around. So that would allow all of the existing SESOM mapping specifications to be converted into the fair mappings metadata instances. And the main classes of this model are the mapping specification, the agents, so basically people or machines that have done something, and then the sources. Next slide, please. And this is, you don't have to read this, but I just want to highlight a couple of things. So this is an example of what that mapping specification metadata could look like. So, but the highlighted things there are that there is a reference to the representation technique of the mapping specification itself, and also the source and target, or in this case, they're called subject and object. Both the type of the source and also the representation technique again. So we are thinking about what is the information that is needed for the user or the person or the thing that is searching. It could be an automated thing that is searching for a mapping specification between two other things. And there might be some requirements on what kind of things, what kind of techniques you can use. Can you process XML schemas, or can you process graphs and so on? And on the next slide, please. These are the current list of enumerations. So there is for the source types. So in the example, you had schemas as on both ends of that mapping specification, but there could be ontologies, databases, vocabularies, APIs, something else. And then it gets interesting when you mix two things that might not go well together. And then for the source representation techniques, there are currently a couple of examples there. So XML schemas, JSON schemas, Shackle, Linkable, SCOS, OWL, and so on. And then for the mapping specification representations, Session was mentioned, R2ML and RML are mapping languages that allows you to go from CSV, JSON, and XML to RDF. Similar to YARM, and also Sparkle is something that you can go from RDF to RDF. XSLT is very versatile. Linkable map is an up-and-coming new, very interesting mapping specification. And of course, you can have all the programming languages. And I would also consider SCOS as a mapping specification, because you have things like related match. And next slide, please. And finally, so we have the conceptual model, we have the mapping metadata model, and then the third part is the mapping recommendations. So these mapping recommendations were original deliverable of the FAIR Impact project, and the working group has been working on extending, basically, or commenting, giving feedback to the original recommendations. And the thing that we have done is basically connected the technical implementation recommendations to those, basically what is a table of recommendations from the deliverable. It's still a work in progress. So basically this means that if there is a recommendation that you should express this kind of information, we show a field to use for that where to put that piece of metadata. But there are some really tricky aspects, like, for example, how to express context. Of course, you can always just have a text field there, but it would be great, or this was also the feedback that we got from the previous plenary, that it would be great if that could be somehow structured. So this would be the context in which the mapping specification, the mapping creation activity happened. So why was it made, or what were not sure why, but context related to that. And then the planned additions, again, more technical recommendations, is that there is a consensus that there will not be one mapping specification recommendation to rule them all. And for example, we have this case study collection that already includes 15 different mapping specification techniques, like RDF reification as one example, or these things that I already mentioned. So rather than having just one, the idea is to, based on the mapping use case, have recommendations on different kinds of mapping specification implementations to use. So some are, and there are pros and cons. So for example, how composable it is, how technology agnostic it is, how's the tooling, and so on. And then recommendations on how to use and how to, for example, embed this FAIR mappings metadata into the mapping specifications or repositories and so on. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Eunice. That was really interesting. It's good to see how much I've been keeping that closely abreast to what the group is doing, but yeah, it seems that the group's made a whole lot of progress in the last year or so. So yeah, thank you, Eunice, and thank you everybody, to all the presenters again. Obviously, there was really some really interesting presentations there, and I think there's a lot of different ways the groups can hopefully interact in terms of what the in terms of the memberships, I guess, certainly, in terms of complementing the outputs that all the groups are working on at the moment. So I know we had a few raised hands earlier in the chat. I don't see any new questions in the chat. So I think it was Marek and Lauren. I think you both had your hands up with the questions. I'll invite you both to unmute. But I will say just before we kind of move on to any questions, all these three groups are still, I know the Harmonized Terminologies group is quite close to at the end of its producing its recommendation, but and the Fair Mappings group and the Verification Genomic Annotations groups are both still working on their recommendations. So please, if you're not already a member, and if you're interested to just keep updated, or if you want to contribute to what they're doing, please feel free to navigate to the RDA website and join the groups. Yeah, Marek or Lauren, I think you had a question earlier. I invite you to unmute.
Thank you. I'm coming back to Sveinung. Sorry, Jonas. I will ask at other time. It was a little bit too much for me. Sveinung, in your model, what I'm a little bit missing or overlook is provenance. How is your minimum metadata model linked to provenance, or is it for one step in a longer pipeline?
No, so it's in there. I mean, the fields. So I mean, you can, if you want to find the slide 20, I think. Right?
Yeah, but, I have it open.
Yeah. I don't. So I'll open the list. No. So I mean, there's a number of fields that are hidden there. So the only fields are there is more like the references between different entities. So in terms of experiment and analysis, which are then there are fields that refer to provenance, how this was done, how was the setup or method, the instrument setup, and for the analysis of what kind of workflow was run and versions and all of that. So we're trying to reuse existing solutions for that, but it's not very detailedly defined yet, though. So, but at least that's where it's meant to be.
Yeah, I'm just coming from a different meeting, which was just before this one, and there is a standard coming from ISO standard for provenance. So maybe you can have a look on it. It should be available in 5 to 6 months.
Okay, that's interesting. I mean, it's also, I mean, we're there's quite much work on things called Workflow Hub in life sciences, which is sort of de facto standard for the. So that's at least something that we will refer to. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Marek. Eunice, I see you have your hand raised as well, but Lauren, did you want to, are you still here? Do you want to circle
Sure.
back?
Yeah, I'm happy.
Yeah.
So a couple of things. So Marek, briefly, it'd be interesting to know what type of provenance metadata, because the provenance is just a huge kind of concept. So I'd just be interested to know what type of provenance metadata. I had a question kind of for Gerhard, which was whether the way that that they're representing experiments metadata might be useful for the materials working group, because we've I'm just curious if you're thinking about like a similar representation of experimental metadata and instrument metadata, and then for Sven, if I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name. I'm wondering for different types of genomic information, if you are thinking about the need for different types, like, or different granularities of metadata, and also briefly if you have any thoughts on how RDA can better collaborate with GA4GH, since that was something that came up in the GA4GH plenary recently. That's it. Thanks.
Yeah, let me take the last first. So I've been actually pushing for that. So I'm also in GA4GH, and we had the session. So I hosted the session at the last GA4GH plenary, where we introduced a bit RDA and got some people talking from RDA Working Groups, including Nico, who is here now. So hopefully that will raise some interest on that side. On the RDA side, I don't really know, but that hopefully you can have some thoughts about that here. The first one was about granularity. I'm a bit unsure if I really got exactly your question. This is actually quite granular metadata because these are referring to specific files that are inside larger data sets typically. So in a sense, this is relatively fine granular, but of course then that refers to the data sets and the higher level granularity. So I don't know exactly, I didn't really understand the question though. Yeah.
This was something that came up like in talking to folks from MBI, where they're saying when they are trying to apply metadata to different genomic sequences, the origin, like so the species can have an impact on the types of metadata that you want to tie to the genomic information. So that's where that came from.
Yeah, I see. We were trying to make things as universally applicable as possible, so probably not going so much into the things that are very specific to species, but it might pop up. I'm not sure.
Was it? Thanks, Sven. There was a question, part of that
You
question,
asked,
Lauren, which I heard. Yeah.
well, I guess you asked about the experiment in our field. It's I think beyond the most obvious that an experiment is an experiment. It's really difficult because all of the details tend to be different, and some of it is just naming, calling things a study. You know, there's not really, people don't talk about studies in material science, but that could be mapped. But then, you know, assays or whatever else you may have that are not so relevant. Then the other question in our field is there are those experiments for which you kind of know molecular information, but there are also plenty for which you don't, where, you know, material is just something, right? That you investigate, and, you know, you have some information about it, maybe. So hence, even when it comes to the composition of what I'm studying, it could be quite kind of, you know, a reference to some other names, right? So this is that's the problem that we have, is that the field in itself is so huge, and things tend to be quite often, I would say, a little bit hard to define. Nevertheless, I mean, because there are definitely examples where people use experiment metadata that do come from biology. The same is true for the use of schema.org. In the absence of materials-related metadata, there are plenty of examples where people use the you know, these sort of bio schema metadata, because they're the only ones that are kind of at least close enough, or some do something. So we find a lot of, yeah, I mean, I'm not sure, I don't want to call it bad practice, but it's just sort of practical approaches that are in the long term also limiting the field. So we need a good standard for our field, and then use the mappings to say, well, this is, you know, maps to the bio experiments or so in a certain way.
Thanks, Gerard, and thanks for those questions, Lauren. So Eunice, I know you have your hand up. We are at the top of the hour, but I think if people are willing to, I think maybe some people will be willing to stay on, others I'm sure will have other meetings to skip to. Maybe we can carry on for a few more minutes. But before I hand over to you, Eunice, I just wanted to put on the screen here just a few upcoming Tiger events. Another cross-fertilization webinar on the topic of repositories, trustworthiness, and certification this day next week. And we also have 2 future hands-on webinars, kind of training sessions on the knowledge base as well. More information there, please register. Eunice, your question, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. I wanted to ask Sveinung about the second mapping example. If you could, Ryan, scroll back there. So, do you consider that as a schema mapping, or is it something else? There you had the one more. No, sorry, the first one. Sorry. Yes, so this one. Because is the thing on the right-hand side, is that a schema or is it something else?
I mean, it is actually defined as a checklist for now. It will be probably made into a JSON schema at some point. Right now, it's more or less a table. I mean, I think it's a schema mapping, though, in principle. That depends.
I think
depends.
so.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so too. Especially when you said that there is a need for adjusting the cardinalities and things like that. Because if you would consider this as a kind of like a semantic alignment between those two lists, then that's the kind of information that usually is not there. So
right.
Yeah. So I'm thinking what would be the source type or the representation type of this experiment's metadata checklist. But if it can be expressed as a JSON schema, then that would do it.
Probably right now it's a web page, I think, with the table.
Yeah.
It's a markdown file actually, but yeah. So, but I mean, that's also probably should be able to represent that, right? Because right now that's what it is. So one should be able to point to something, right?
Yeah, but then it's a correspondence between those.
Then it's a correspondence. I would say so. Yes.
Okay. I see some people have made their goodbyes. Does anyone else have any questions they want to maybe put to any of the groups before we wrap up? A quick look at the chat. As I said, I'll just put back on the screen the hyperlink or the QR code links to these events we have coming up over the next few weeks. As I said, the Tiger project is wrapping up now in the next at the end of the year, but we will be working very feverishly on deliverables, and that deliverable I mentioned earlier on the large scale mapping of RDA groups and their outputs to various aspects of the European research landscape, and will be published in the next couple of weeks. We'll do a lot more further promotion on that in the early part of next year, and so please keep an eye out for that. If there are no more questions, I will I guess we can wrap up. I have a school collection to do in about 10 minutes, so I need to get ready for that as well. So just thank all the presenters. I know this was relatively short notice, I think, but it's really, really useful, and we really appreciate it from the Tiger perspective, their inputs and their work, I guess, over the last couple of years as well, those groups who we've been supporting. Thanks everybody for registering and joining today. I'll send around a link to the recording, hopefully for the end of the week. And this will be later on added onto the YouTube channel. Yeah, and please, the final thing, please, if you are interested in any what these groups are doing, please reach out to the presenters here, the co-chairs, or just join the group. But the easiest way to keep track of what's happening there. With that, I will wrap up. Thanks all again for joining, and have a good day.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.